Yep. That's 2 engine failures for you next time. That'll be more than 1 engine failure for you next time. Yes, sir. Yeah, I'll do that. So my name is Reese. I've been a member of the AOA since I believe 2017. And November 11111, which has been sold, it's now down in Florida. Been around the Aerostar since I was 10 years old, and that's because, should I do that? All right, into the mic, that's gonna be fun. So, okay, so 10 years old, that's because my dad was Ted Smith's third hire, and had a lot to do with the overall design of the Aerostar, with a whole bunch of patents and all that kind of stuff. So have a definite affinity for the airplane, and have enjoyed the opportunity to be involved in this organization for the last, whatever that is, 7, 8 years now. So it's been a lot of fun. In between airplanes, I've got another one that's being worked on. Actually, there's 2 of them up at Jim Christie's shop that I'll get to fly once they finally get done. So been teaching, and this is thanks to Jim. I was out, I think I'd gone out for something with 111, and he said, Eric, you know a lot about the airplane, and you've been flying them. Why don't you start teaching them? And I go, oh man, that means I got to go back and reinstate my instructor's rating, which I had let lapse years earlier, and at the time didn't have an MEI. So I thought about it, went back at it, and talked to a designated pilot examiner in the Seattle area who's a great guy, who said, hey, I'll make you a deal. I said, I'll do the training. I want to get my DPE for multi-engine. And well, how are we going to do that? I said, well, I'll do the training for you, and then that way I'll get the 10 hours of PIC time in my logbook in order to get the additional add-on. So we did that, took the check ride in 111, and this was in August of 17, with the FAA guy who'd never been in an Aerostar, with the DPE giving my instructor's check ride at the same time he's getting his check ride from the FAA. And it worked out great. So the syllabus was, thanks to Ron Cox and AOA, the syllabus was built on their training material from scratch at that time, and that's what we used. And the check ride came off without a hitch, and the FAA guy that did the check ride for both of us, they had to work some stuff out, because now how's he actually administer this check ride not having any experience in the Aerostar? So that's kind of how that all started, and thanks to Jim, he kind of encouraged me to do it, and haven't looked back ever since. Now, hopefully this is not an issue going forward. So 5 years ago at the Salt Lake, it was the Salt Lake AOA Convention, I was asked to come up and do a talk, and similar stuff, but one of the things I got curious about was VMC, takeoff speeds that were in the POH for the Aerostar. And I found a video out there by an Air Force test pilot, which I'm going to show again. And some of you guys have seen it, but there's enough new people now that we just don't, they haven't seen it before, but it's really good. Plus the guy sounds like Sean Connery, and I really like that. So 10 minutes with that. I'll get into a little bit of the thought process on what I think Piper and Ted Smith did with the POHs over time, and they changed the takeoff speeds to be more safe, that was more related to what Harold Hullings was talking about in this video. And then move on from there to talk a little bit about where we're at. Let me get this thing going straight here. Get into this whole engine failure issue. And I got thinking about how little practice we actually get. Get your multi-engine rating, you do some engine cuts, you do some OEI or one engine in operative work, and then you go fly. And unless you're in a program that's requiring recurrent training, you're not getting anything by yourself because you usually don't go out and do it. And the simulators are good. They're good for the muscle memory on just knowing what to do, but they just aren't the same for the way it feels and what happens psychologically when you actually see that thing stop out there. So we'll talk a little bit about that, some statistics on catastrophic engine failures and fatalities. And that was one that I thought, that's too high, and we got to stop that. And if I just keep rambling on, I'm going to mess up my whole flow. Love this little thing because it's always learning and teaching. And if you want to know the difference between the master and the beginner, the master's failed more times than the beginner has ever tried. So I keep trying and trying and trying and trying. So this is a video. The first part of the video is there's no sound. It's just the accident. And again, I took a 40-minute video, which is still out there, and knocked it down to 10 minutes.
The U.S. Air Force Test Pilot School in 1985.
Hear that okay? I heard it for a moment. Now I don't. Your mic stopped working.
It is possible to maintain control of the airplane with that engine still inoperative and thereafter maintain straight flight at the same speed with an angle of bank of not more than 5 degrees. There is 2 requirements for the magnitude of VMC in this regulation. The first is maintain control, that is recover following a sudden failure, and number 2 is maintain straight flight during the remainder of the flight while an engine is inoperative. Please notice that there is absolutely no requirement for maintaining control during turns at airspeeds as low as VMC, only for straight flight. VMCA for minimum control speed in the air will be used in this presentation rather than VMC. VMCA is more commonly used today to distinguish between other VMCs. The VMCA of an airplane is published in the limitations section of its flight manual. VMCA is also presented with a red radial line on the airspeed indicator or on equivalent electronic displays or on a placard in clear view of the pilot and as close as possible to the airspeed indicator for heavier and turbine-powered Part 23 airplanes. The blue line speed is VYSE, the airspeed for maximum rate of climb with a single engine. So, VMCA must be an important limitation. But what exactly is VMCA? Let's go back to its origin. Directional control after engine failure. Engine failure causes the airplane to yaw into the failed engine. A rudder side force is and stays required to counteract the thrust-induced yawing moment. This rudder side force also causes displacement to the dead engine side, hence a side slip starts to increase. This increase in side slip results in an increasing opposite side force due to side slip caused by the fuselage and the vertical tail. The rudder needs to overcome this side force too, increasing the required rudder deflection. When a balance of side forces is achieved, the side slip increases no more. There is a minimum airspeed to generate the required side force for balancing the thrust yawing moment and the side force due to side slip. We'll get to that later. Lateral control after engine failure. A side effect of yawing after engine failure is rolling due to the increased speed of the good wing and less propulsive lift of the wing section behind the propeller, and less lift of the affected wing because the section of the wing is blanked from the wind by the fuselage due to the side slip. So, aileron deflection is required to recover and to maintain the desired bank angle. The VMC requirement in the aviation regulation require the rudder and ailerons to be large enough for counteracting the yawing and rolling moments at an airspeed as low as VMCA. When, after engine failure, the wings are kept level, a side slip cannot be avoided. However, side slip causes drag, and drag degrades the climb performance. Especially when an engine fails immediately after liftoff, you need maximum available climb performance, and hence you would select maximum thrust on a good engine, and you would like minimum drag by reducing the side slip angle. This can easily be achieved, as I will show you later. The rudder and the ailerons are the only aerodynamic control surfaces available to the pilot for maintaining an equilibrium, a balance of forces and moments after engine failure. A few words on tail design. Aviation regulations require for Part 23 airplanes a VMCA to be less than or equal to 1.2 vstall, so the tail cannot be made too small. The takeoff speed must be greater than or equal to 1.05 VMCA, a 5% safety margin above the minimum control speed. This bank angle has also effect on the minimum control speed. The design engineer calculates this graph during sizing the vertical tail of this sample airplane. The graph shows VMCA and side slip versus bank angle when the left engine, number 1, is inoperative. When the wings are level, VMCA is calculated to be 120 knots and the side slip is 14 degrees, which means a lot of drag. For zero side slip, that is minimum drag, the bank angle needed is 4 degrees. VMCA will then be 95 knots. This is the design VMCA of the airplane that will be verified during flight tests. This VMCA is only valid if the bank angle is 4 degrees. This blue line shows the actual VMCA, being the VMCA that the pilot would experience in flight for changing bank angles. The actual VMCA increases when the bank angle is smaller or larger than the favorable 4 degrees bank angle for this sample airplane. If the indicated airspeed is lower than the actual VMCA, the shaded area, the control will be lost at maximum thrust. Remember, both VMCA and side slip, that is drag, increase if a small bank angle away from the inoperative engine is not maintained. The banking is to the same side as the leg pressure on the rudder pedal. The pilot controls the actual VMCA and the remaining performance with rudder, ailerons and the throttle, magnitude of the asymmetrical thrust. If the rudder is not up to maximum for maintaining the heading, we also call that a partial rudder, a higher airspeed is required. The actual VMCA is higher. If the ailerons are not up to maximum to prevent rolling, a higher airspeed is required. The actual VMCA will be higher. If the airplane keeps yawing and or rolling despite maximum rudder and or aileron, the only option for the pilot to prevent the loss of control is to reduce the thrust just a little. Then the asymmetrical thrust is lower and less rudder is required to counteract. The actual VMCA will be lower. As soon as control is re-established and 5 degrees of bank into the good engine is attained, thrust can be increased again to maximum. In red, this first wings level test point. Then the test continues. This graph, made by the tail design engineer, was shown before. The bank angle is gradually increased to the bank angle for zero side slip as used for tail design, after which the airspeed can be further decreased until, with zero side slip, again one of the rudder and aileron limitations is reached. This is the static VMCA for thereafter, as was defined in the aviation regulation of VMC. This static VMCA is approximately 8 knots for a small twin and 30 knots for a 4-engine turbofan, lower than wings level VMCA. These 2 points are the only test points during flight testing to determine the static VMCA. But the aviation regulations require another test to be conducted, the dynamic VMCA test, during which the critical engine is suddenly made inoperative at decreasing airspeed test points. The aviation regulations require that the deviations from the flight path in yaw and roll must stay within certain limits, and an average pilot must be able to recover the airplane. The highest of static and dynamic VMCAs, which is usually the static, will be published in the airplane flight manuals, the standardized VMCA of the airplane. This VMCA is always safe, even when the thrust is or is increased to maximum, provided straight flight with a 5 degrees of bank into the good engine is maintained. Takeoff speed small twins. I repeat it once more, keeping the wings level increases VMCA to a higher actual value. The increase is approximately 8 knots for a small twin. The takeoff speed of small twins is required to be 1.05 times VMCA. This 5% safety margin is, however, not high enough. Since the wings are level at liftoff, it is recommended to use at least 1.05 VMCA plus 10 knots as a safe takeoff speed for a small twin. Ask the manufacturer of your airplane for the wings level VMCA so that you can add 5% safety margin to that speed. Following engine failure, attaining 5 degrees away from the inoperative engine should never be delayed, because bank angle is required for both performance and control. We'll now review the 2 accidents showed in the beginning again and show you what happened. Now the view from inside the cockpit from the left seat. The takeoff run starts. Everything looks all right. Rotation is at 75 knots, 16 knots below the takeoff speed of 91, 12 knots below the red line VMCA, and even 20 knots below actual wings level VMCA. Right after liftoff, engine number 2 failed at an airspeed of 82 knots below the red line VMCA. The loss of control was a fact. What went wrong on this accident? The published standardized VMCA in the flight manual was 87 knots. The regulatory takeoff speed would then be 5% higher, is 91 knots. The actual VMCA at rotation with the wings level is 87 plus approximately 8 knots, is 95 knots. The pilot rotated early at 75 knots, 16 knots below takeoff speed and 20 knots below the actual wings level VMCA. Way too early. The right non-critical engine failed at 82 knots, 5 knots below VMCA and even 13 knots below actual VMCA. The ailerons were either not maximum or not effective enough at too low a speed. There was an immediate loss of control by VMCA definition. It was not a stall. Takeoff speed with wings level should have been 1.05 times the wings level VMCA. That is 1.05 times 95 is 100 knots at least. This accident could have been prevented by delaying rotation until the airspeed was 100 knots, and thereafter by maintaining straight flight with 5 degrees of bank into the good engine. a few do's and don'ts. Always delay rotation until the indicated airspeed is at least 10 knots higher than the takeoff speed. After engine failure, bank 5 degrees as soon as possible to the same side as the rudder pressure. Always maintain straight flight until reaching a safe altitude. Maybe that should be at least 1,000 feet. When a turn is required, reduce asymmetrical thrust and the rudder bit and make a shallow turn. You might lose some altitude because of the drag. When the rudder is near maximum, the actual VMCA and the loss of control are close. Increase your speed. Before increasing the thrust to maximum, when the airspeed is low, bank 5 degrees again into the good engine. During cruise with one engine inoperative, fly VYSE plus bank 2 to 3 degrees for minimum drag and for minimum descent. A long straight-in approach is much safer than increasing the thrust during the final turn for landing for maintaining the approach path. When the airspeed is low, never ever increase thrust to maximum without banking 5 degrees into the good engine first, and thereafter maintain straight flight with that bank angle. Increase the rudder and the ailerons with the thrust.
All right. Pretty amazing when you watch that airplane basically snap roll right into the ground. And I don't think there's anybody alive who could recover from that, especially with how poorly the takeoff was managed and how slow that rotation actually occurred. I figure out which direction I'm going. So what got me going, and a lot of the topics that I come up with are based on curiosity, and this was one of those to where I'm looking at the different POHs because I'm flying different airplanes, and I'm looking at the performance charts and looking at takeoff speed. And I go, why are they so different? And you go back to the 600 as an example, and I'll show you the charts here in a second, and I go, why is that the way it is? Takeoff speed, 85 knots. 1 knot above VMC. So you know if you get off the ground, you're doing 85 knots, you lose an engine, you're gonna lose control of the airplane. So why did they do that? And just based on the numbers that the colonel's talking about here, takeoff speed should be 5% above VMC, and that puts it at 88 knots. And VMC assumes 3 to 5 degrees of bank into the good engine, and at rotation, the wings are level. So we've got to add that extra safety margin of 8 knots. So 88 and 8 is 96. And what all the instructors in here that I'm dealing with regularly, we're all teaching rotate at 95. And if you do that, the airplane will come off, the mains will come off the runway right about 100 knots. Your VXSE, and it's perfect. And you're not going to have to worry about losing any kind of control, and the airplane will fly out of that just fine. And then looking at what factors cause VMC, and there's one in here that I just wanted to bring up is specifically, but rearward CG location, these all make it higher, decrease in weight. You'd think, wow, wait a minute, decrease in weight, the airplane's lighter, the VMC should actually go down. No, it goes up. Landing gear position, flap position, wind milling propeller, obviously, and slide slip condition. And the note that I was making, based on what he's talking about here, about the control and making sure you have 3 to 5 degrees of bank into the good engine. Not only that 3 to 5 degrees coincides with about 200 feet a minute in climb rate. And in 601P on a warm day, moderate load, it can mean the difference between 50 feet a minute down and 150 feet a minute climb. That's all the difference in the world. So here's the example. This is a Aerostar 600 right out of the POH, 5,500 pounds or less, takeoff speed 85 knots. That's pretty darn slow. The reason I think, and I think the guys that are still here that were at Aerostar when some of this stuff was being done, this was a performance chart for total takeoff distance to 50 feet, not maintaining control of the airplane with an engine when an engine quits. So this was just designed as, okay, how are we going to get the best takeoff performance?
Performance charts.
Yeah, they're performance charts. But I think a lot of people tend to go, okay, well, that's the speed I should actually take off at and rotate at. I don't think that's happening anymore, but this is just kind of what happened. And then you jump into a little bit later, you go to a 601P, and they show two different weights, 6,000, 5,700, 87 and 85 knots. Jump to the 602P, still about the same at 6,000 and 5,750, 87 and 88. And it wasn't until the 700P came out where they didn't have any differences in speeds. It was all takeoff speed at 94 knots. And I think over time they kind of figured this out and, okay, what's safer for normal operations. And the other thing that I wanted to point out, these cards, light twin takeoff and control and performance briefing cards, are available. You can just go out, Google it online, and they're PDF files that you can print out. Highly recommend you do this periodically, not necessarily on every flight. If you're going out of the same airport, the conditions are going to be pretty close, but going out of airports that are up a little bit higher, especially, know what your best rate of climb is with one engine. Know what the service ceiling is so that you have that information ahead of time, so there's no hesitation in making a decision on what to do or not to do after you've lost an engine. A great example, the 700s are fantastic with performance, but if you fly them at gross weight at 6850, when you have one that's set up that way, you get the same issues you do in a 601P on a hot day, high density altitude. And coming out from back east last summer, we were, I think, in Great Falls or someplace in Idaho. What the Great Falls is Montana, and hot day. We're thinking, well, let's put another 44 gallons of fuel in the airplane. It's cheap here. And then we look at the takeoff performance. If we lost an engine, 50 feet a minute on that day with the 700, but that's loaded up at gross weight. Take that 250 gallons out, or not 250 gallons, 250 pounds out that we didn't need. It went up to almost 200. That's a big margin, and the airplane's fine at 200 feet a minute. You can get up and climb around and get back to the pattern. So think about those things, before you're just jumping in the airplane and taking off fat, dumb, and happy. So the curiosity thing got me thinking about engine failures. And so I went out and I did just some basic research online and found information that AvWeb, AOPA, NTSB published. And I was thinking, well, what's the breakdown of engine failures for all, single and multi-engine airplanes, general aviation airplanes? So this is not breaking the twins and singles down per se, but it's an engine. How often does an engine fail? And I was curious specifically about catastrophic engine failure. So 10% catastrophic, 30% fuel management issues, 25% mechanical failures, 20% component failures, 15% overheating, most of that due to oil starvation, and then 10% catastrophic engine failures or a complete engine shutdown or destruction. And jumping a little bit further, what percentage of these engine failures actually result in fatalities? Fuel management issues, only 5 to 10%. Mechanical failures, and 10 to 15%. Engine overheating, 5%. Component failures, 10%. Catastrophic engine failures, now this is in multi-engine aircraft, 30%. It's pretty high. I mean, 30% of the time that you have a catastrophic engine failure, all phases of flight, it's going to result in fatalities. It's too high. And I think there's a lot of things that we can do to help solve that problem. Differences between singles and twins. And this one I found interesting because there's a lot of stuff out there about, oh yeah, well, singles are still safer than twins, and twin engine airplanes are more dangerous, and you're more likely to get killed in a twin. Not so. Single engine fatality rates for those same issues, fuel management 25%, engine failures 30, engine overheating 15, component failures 25, catastrophic engine failures in single engine aircraft 60% of the time result in fatalities. That kind of does make sense because they're flying singles over the mountains at night in icing conditions and all that kind of crazy stuff. And then multi-engine rates, so fuel management 10%, mechanical 15, engine overheating 5, basically about half. And then the multi-engine fatality rates on a catastrophic engine failure 30%. So based on the data from NTSB and other sources, approximately 100 to 150 accidents annually. You can do the math and figure out, how many fatal accidents in twins are caused by catastrophic failures. It's about 30, so you just do the math here, it's about 30 of them. And I went back and looked up how many failures happened in twins over the last couple of years, and I think there were 34 in 2023. So it's pretty close. And that's my smell test, is the numbers that I'm getting off the internet correct. So how do we reduce these risks? Regular maintenance. And I'm not going to talk about the maintenance side of things because there's a lot of other people that know a heck of a lot more about that than I do, but just doing maintenance that's required. Fix the stuff when it breaks. If you've got something that's going bad, fix it. And don't wait, don't defer it. And that's some of the stuff that we talk about with new people coming into this, is that there's a cost to maintain these airplanes to a point where they're going to be reliable and safe. And don't let anybody fool you. If you put the time, effort, and money into it, you're going to have a very safe, reliable airplane, even with the Aerostars, as complex as they actually are. Thorough pre-flight planning and looking at your contingencies. Where are you going? What's my performance of the airplane going to be? Proficiency training. And this thing I'll talk a little bit more about later, but we're not doing enough. And the insurance companies are requiring annual recurrent training. In some cases, every 2 years, annual recurrent training, and in some cases, none. So that's something we really need to think about, and this talk about simulators being available is really going to help, especially just getting people to go in. Instead of spending $1,000 an hour flying your Aerostar around, you can spend a couple $100 an hour flying a simulator and at least get the drill down. Understanding the aircraft's performance charts like Ken just mentioned are super important, but understand how to use them. And critical altitude awareness. This is where your single engine service ceiling comes in as well. I mean, if you just take off somewhere and are going on a cross country and haven't really looked at it, planned out what it is, if you do have an engine failure in cruise, you have a much higher chance of having a safe outcome if you actually know what that single engine service ceiling is, and if you need to turn around. I mean, a lot of people, I'll keep going to my destination or another airport. Yeah, but can you actually make it? Fuel management is not too, I don't think I've heard of any fuel starvation, except for the ones that happened way, way back in the Aerostar. Most of us are pretty good with that, but this is in general. Use of checklists. In my training, I see a lot of people start to get complacent on that. They use a flow, which is great, but a flow in combination with the checklist, like the airlines do, is your best bet. I needed a checklist for my stupid cell phone up here that I was going to record this on, and guess what button I didn't push? Record. So it's even simple things as we get distracted and oh, I gotta get up there, I gotta plug it in, I gotta make sure that it's going to show up on the screen and everything, and got distracted and didn't push the button. And effective cockpit resource management, CRM, which the airline guys all know what that is, but with us in the airplane, it's managing, where's our stuff? Can we get at it easily? If I have somebody sitting in the right seat, whether it's a friend or your wife or husband or whatever, you can still utilize their eyes, ears, and help in controlling and working through an emergency situation. And then staying within the operating limits. And that, staying within the operating limits, like I just mentioned with the 700s on a hot day, I don't need to carry that extra fuel. And don't carry it. The airplane performs fine at gross weight, except if you lose an engine, it's going to be a handful. So how do we reduce the risks? Well, not all of us are A&Ps. We don't need to know what's causing an issue, but what we do need to know is to be aware that there is something going on. What's different? Has something changed? I was talking about this last night with fuel flow. And it was Joel Stout, and we're just talking about engine failures and that sort of thing. And he's watching in an airplane the fuel flow continue to rise and continue to rise, continue to rise. The engine's running fine. And then, wait a minute, and then it got really high. What did you say? It got up to about 50 gallons an hour? And you go, I think I better shut this engine down. And it's like, and it turned out the fuel was leaking and being dumped inside the nacelle. Well, that's a fire hazard. We'll talk about shutting engines down here in a minute. Engine analyzer data. There are a few of you, and I don't know if anybody in here, but there's a few of you out there still flying Aerostars with stock engine temperature gauges. You've got one CHT. What cylinder is that on? 3. Yeah, huh? Okay, well, I think most of them are on 3. Okay. Yeah, supposed to be the hottest one. Well, actually, of the ones that I've flown, I think I've flown probably 30 or 40 of them now. It's been on 3. I learn something every time I come up here and do this, but you need to know that. And then the second thing is if it's turbocharged, you've got, it says EGT, but it's really a DIT. And which side, is it left or right side? And what cylinders does that coincide with? Just to kind of know what's going on. But just looking for changes in those things. But if you have one cylinder head temp on one cylinder, what happens if you're starting to see a problem with other cylinders that aren't being measured? You'll never know it. And the example we're going to show in here does have an engine analyzer. We've got all the data and everything, but if we didn't have an engine analyzer, the pilot would have never known this was going on until the engine actually self-destructed. Basically, having one can save thousands, if not more, if you catch things early. Unusual engine sounds. I mean, use your ears, use your eyes, your nose, your senses, vibration, your butt. All that stuff comes into play. I'm not going to go through these in a bunch of detail because I'll go over my time limit. But how many times you've been out there and you go, this engine's vibrating more than it's supposed to? Is it the prop phasing or is it something else? Reduction in power output. Here's one that a lot of us have had happen. You're flying along in the flight levels and you're running at, say, 30 inches of manifold pressure, and all of a sudden you hear this kind of a thumping pop, and your manifold pressure's down around 10. What happened? And, yep, so you all of a sudden have a normally aspirated engine up there. Now, what do you do about it? Changes in engine parameters, sudden changes in oil pressure, temperature, fuel pressure, like Joel's situation with fuel pressure changing. What does that mean to you? What should I do? Fuel and oil consumption. This has to be done on more of a longer term basis where you're tracking. And I know that if you want to learn how to track stuff on your engine, talk to Brennan, because he's definitely an analyst and has the charts to prove it. And he could tell you probably to the 10th of a quart how many quarts per hour he burns in his airplane, which is great to know because if it starts to change, that's telling you something's happening. And then visual inspection of the exhaust. You can tell a lot by just looking at the color. Is it real black? Is it kind of gooey or oily? That could mean you've got oil leak, or you could have blow-by on the cylinders, or is it nice and dry and gray? And then though there's some that have the magnetic plug inspections, and I think the filter screens don't get, the sump filters, or yeah, that sump port screen doesn't get checked as often as it probably should. Regular maintenance, including your pre-flights, be attentive, and monitoring things during flight are crucial. And then practice. This is the one, you know, that's going to be open for discussion because everybody's a little different. But in my opinion, well, it's the question, you know, why do we think we can do engine out drills once every year or two and think we're safe? We're not. And I've proved it myself, gone out in a simulator and tried to, I thought, well, shoot, the airline guys do these V1 cuts. Let's go see if I can handle the airplane, lose an engine at 50 feet in the fog. I've done basically went and did a 0-0 takeoff, which is legal under Part 91, not very smart, but can I handle it? And the answer was no, I didn't die, but I broke the airplane. It took a few tries to kind of get it down. This was in a 421 simulator. The practice. Now we're not going to go do that, but that's just one of those curiosity things to, you know, spend more time during your recurrent training and practice this stuff. So we don't have to go up and do it in the airplane 7 or 8 times before you get it down. There's going to be a lot of talk about simulators, and I know Zylan's here, who I've met out of Seattle, which Ken mentioned, about the simulator stuff. The simulators are good, and they're going to help a lot, but they're just not the same thing. So it's a combination of mostly simulators and going out and doing the single engine work in the airplane in a safe environment that's both safe for the pilots and the aircraft is actually priceless and invaluable because you just don't get the same feeling. And actually, here's one situation in the 700. Somebody probably seen this, but this is kind of a fun shutdown, and I've done this a lot in 111, and I've done similar shutdowns with most of my recurrent training pilots. Throttle back. And that's good. Left coming back, feather. And that did feather, so that's good. We're still doing about 130. And we're climbing at 400 feet a minute, get the blue line. Got that 3 to 5 degrees of bank in there. So it's just kind of showing that the airplane's easy to control, and it will climb. And we were at about 60, I've got a 6850 gross weight airplane, so we were at about 6,400 pounds at this time. So I had two 250 pounders with me, and pretty much full fuel. So this you guys have already seen. If you're, Brennan published this, and it's fairly recent, from the NTSB safety alerts. And there's only one piece that I really want to cover in here because we'll talk a little bit more about this as we go on. We all talk about and we train, and the checklists are all designed around a loss of engine, basically right after takeoff. And obviously there's procedures in the books that talk about, you know, in cruise flight and that sort of thing, and what you do. But nowhere in there does it talk about partial loss of power and what really to do and when to shut down an engine with partial loss of power. Most of the time, it's probably better off just leaving it running. But there are cases when you definitely want to be thinking about shutting it down. Again, like Joel's example. And the other thing that's kind of interesting, and I never really thought about this, but our propellers have start locks in them. So that when we shut the engines down, when RPMs drop down, and according to the Hartzell manual, it's about 800 RPM. When that RPM drops below 800, it won't go into feather. Otherwise, every time we shut down, the props would go into feather. Well, what happens if you have an engine failure situation where the prop is slowing down for whatever reason? It doesn't matter what, but it's slowing down. You better feather that thing before you reach that 800 RPM, otherwise you can't. And that's not going to be good in an engine failure situation. The delayed engine, or delayed propeller, not enough coffee, delayed propeller feathering and a partial loss can be pretty dangerous. Recently, and this didn't have to do with partial loss, but there was a Cessna 310, I think in Southern California, that crashed, and it did burn, but the occupants made it out okay. That guy lost an engine, never put the gear up, never put the flaps up, never feathered the engine. If he had, he would have been able to fly around the pattern and land it safely. Why he didn't? Probably lack of practice and just froze. This one, the last little thing in here in under part 23, and think about it a little bit. It said under part 23, which our airplanes were designed, they're not required to provide a positive rate of climb with one engine inoperative. And what does that mean? That's one engine's windmilling. So yeah, most of them won't climb with a windmilling engine. And so timely feathering is super important because the climb rates and the tables are all based on a feathered engine and 3 to 5 degrees of bank and minimum drag. So getting into some of the scenarios, I don't have time to go through each one of these, but I just thought it'd be interesting. I've had, call them engine failures, no catastrophic, but 7 of them over the 48 years that I've been flying. First one was in an Aero at night in the clouds, and part 135, partial loss of power. Basically, I couldn't maintain altitude and had an airport made. Power came back. They never figured out what happened. I hate those. Piper Navajo. This has the same engine that the Aerostar Super 2 has in it. So I'd taken off again at night, which most of my 135 was around 1980. Again, 43 inches of manifold pressure on takeoff. It dropped to 30. And that was a case where, should I have shut it down or not? I didn't. Flew around the pattern, went and landed. Again, they never figured out what happened. And I flew that airplane a lot afterwards and never did it again. Cessna 404, that's a Titan. It has the Gitzo 520, it's a geared, Continental geared engine at 375 horsepower. It's basically a Conquest, non-pressurized Conquest airframe. And that one, similar to Joel's situation, had passengers in the airplane, and we started to get air show smoke coming out of the left engine. And I thought about it for a minute. I had a co-pilot with me, thought about it for a minute, and I just said, hey, I'll just keep flying the airplane. You watch all the gauge. If you see anything change with oil pressure or temperature, I'll shut it down immediately. I thought about it maybe for another 15 seconds, and I'm going, wait a minute, smoke? I don't know what's causing it. I think it's oil. But what if it's something else, and what if I end up with a fire? Shut it down instantly, landed uneventfully. One of the other Aerostars, partial loss of power. This was one that was due to induction leaks, and it was not constant. It was bouncing around all over the place. We were close to home base and just went and landed uneventfully. 7 Mike Echo, which is the airplane I'm going to have use of again once Aerostar's done with it. That was a full shutdown due to oil loss. The oil loss was due to the dipstick. I even wrote there's a YouTube video out there about dipsticks and unforeseen consequences. Dipsticks meaning the pilots. So those of you who don't have the U2A engines, your dipstick has a ring that you pull with a cam on it that releases the lock, and it'll pop out. Some of those, if you push down on that ring, when you push the dipstick back into the filler hole, it'll actually push the filler, the cap back up again a little bit. And it'll push it up enough to where the crankcase pressure will pop the dipstick off. That's what happened. And we dumped 5 quarts of oil out of that engine before actually looking out and finally seeing it, and then immediately shut it down and landed. And we were doing takeoff and landing work, so we were basically in the pattern at this particular airport, so it was no big deal. 111, another one, this is written up in the AOA forum, cylinder issue. And this is one where I made a decision, the engine's running fine, don't know what's going on with it because of how rough and how much it was surging. In that case, I'm 15,000 feet above an airport, clear air, and told center that I had a rough running engine, and they cleared me direct to the airport, landed uneventfully. But on the way down, I thought, well, what happened? What if something else is going on here? I mean, I'm in a perfectly safe condition to shut the engine down, and decided to do so. I didn't want to get into a position to where it seized or did something weird, and I couldn't feather it, because now I've got the drag of a either windmilling or stopped prop at flat pitch. And then the latest one, which we're going to go through the whole thing, and this is the anatomy of a impending engine failure and what we saw in the airplane, what we missed, and you tell me, should we have shut this engine down or not? So this was August 10th last year. New client, first flight in his Aerostar, 767 captain. So lots of experience, lots of GA experience. Nothing wrong that he was doing, but new airplane, new avionics. Insight G4 engine analyzer, which I've used before, but not in a lot of detail. They're fairly small, hard to read. He had never used it, so he wasn't even really looking at it. He was concentrating on flying the airplane. So what I did is I took, this is actually all videoed, and I will make a video of this. It's in 4K, so it's pretty good. So I took screenshots at different times during the flight so you could see what we could have seen with the engine analyzer to figure out what was going on earlier than we actually found it. So this is the first takeoff, and I want you to pay attention more, I think, just pay attention to the bars on the Insight. So we're looking at the left engine, right engine. Everything doesn't look too out of whack here. Pretty straightforward. So this was the first takeoff. Hadn't been flown for quite a while. Aerostar had done all the full power run-ups, and everything was good to go. It was dialed in pretty darn good. And did the takeoff. And so we're here. We're at just about full power. Again, looking at the analyzer. Yeah, both TITs on each side are pretty good. The CHTs all look normal, and you can't. This is one of my gripes about the Insight is the EGT bars are hard to see because they're small and gray. One thing that the previous owner of this airplane did, or somebody did, they actually wrote down the TIT 1 and 2, and they've got it down below the analyzer. So, okay, what cylinders am I looking at? And I thought that was a really great idea. And how many of you really know, okay, what cylinders or what bank, left, right, am I looking at with that TIT? And that comes into play in troubleshooting when you're going through some of this stuff. Climbing out, we decided to climb to 6,500 feet where we're going to do our air work. So normal 700 power settings at 37 inches and 2,400 RPM. Look at the fuel flow, which you can't see on here, but 37 gallons per hour per side. But actually you can, it's on the Insight. I think it's like, I can see like 37.3 and 37.1, so they're very, very close. Everything looks pretty nominal. This airplane, the CHTs aren't as even as the ones in the right, but that's not a big deal here. So 10 minutes into the flight, we're level at 6,500. Mixtures are now leaned. We're at about 24 inches and 2,200 RPM, so a pretty low power setting, which I typically use when we're cruising around doing training. And the EGTs were up around 1570. So everything's looking pretty nominal. The 1 and 2 on the left engine are pretty close, and 1 and 2 on the right are pretty close. Nothing to be concerned about at that point in time. So 38 minutes into the flight, and we'd been doing some instrument work and holds and stuff like that. After landing and taxiing back to the runway, now at rotation, this is what we see. Still pretty nominal, except that what's different here? Yeah, the TIT 1 and 2 on the left engine are different. They're not even like they were before. Again, at this stage of the game, nothing to really raise a concern, although noticed it. And then 41 minutes into the flight after turning downwind, leveling off at pattern altitude, notice that TIT1 on the left has dropped even more. Now both of them have come down because we've reduced the power and we're still full rich here. 42 minutes into the flight, turning base to final, number 4 is dropping out. It's really low. At this point in time, because these were the first landings that the new owners were doing, I'm focused on performance of the airplane and what he's doing and speeds and all that kind of stuff, which he was doing fine. And not noticing at this time number 4. But so this was a warning sign. Then further on into the flight, we're lined up on the runway, ready to go, look down and check everything, and everything looks nominal again on the insight. So one little thing got missed, and it's changed again. So now, after liftoff, gear's coming up. Now we see CHT4's back up again, and TIT's down. So something's changing, and this is about the time when I started noticing I better kind of look at this stuff because it's changing. I didn't know what was going on, just stuff's moving around. It shouldn't be. So 54 minutes into the flight on base leg, now we're getting set up to go land again. Now I really notice it, and number 4's dropped out. The TIT's down on that side as well. What the heck's going on? So I'm just going to watch it really carefully. We're continuing to fly this pattern, and then at this point in time, let's see, we're on base leg. And I looked at this and I said to Todd, hey, I don't like this, let's go back to Coeur d'Alene. So we're already at a kind of a cruise power setting, so we pretty much stayed here. We climbed up a little bit and decided to just continue back home. It was running okay, it wasn't running rough, never felt anything, and went back to Aerostar and landed. And this is the good picture that I took with the still camera. So you can see the number 4 is low on the CHT. There's no EGT even registering. Temperature's way down, TIT's down, and then the mechanical TIT gauges that were in the airplane, you can kind of figure out just by looking at how they are relative to the TIT temperatures. Looks like the one on the left is the number 1 TIT position, and same thing for the right engine. So back at Aerostar, go through the normal stuff. Okay, engine's running fine, number 4 drops out, and of course we have all kinds of other things like valve springs that we've seen issues with before with Bill Ulrich's airplane. So they go through the normal stuff. Okay, compression's good, and look at the fuel injectors. The fuel injectors were okay. And there was a bunch of other stuff that I can't remember. I know Bill or Jim Christie was there when we were doing this. And then they pulled a rocker cover off after we'd left and found that rocker, you could just move it. It was just free. So the whole valve train on that side had something was going on. And then, I don't know, when you guys opened that up, I think you found some pretty big chunks of metal in there. And the cam had started to come apart between 3 and 4. There's a common lobe, and I don't know whether it's the exhaust valve or intake valve, doesn't really matter, but it was coming apart. But the weird thing, and I don't know the answer to this one, is on that right picture, that's the case up between 1 and 2 on the number 2 side, so it's left side. That's something got pushed up into it from the inside. And we're thinking later on, this cam's coming apart, there's big chunks of metal floating around in the engine. How much longer would that engine have lasted before it really started to come apart? And there's the question about, is this one of those cases that, we're at a safe altitude, we're close to the home base, is this one of those situations where We should have caged it and just landed. I don't know. And there's a lot of judgment calls in to cage or not to cage. And where do you go from here? I don't know. But it was interesting. I'd be really curious to see what that engine looks like taken apart, to see what actually did fail. And that is, I think I made that in an hour. Yeah. Any questions on that? And afterwards, I'm happy to talk all day long about this stuff, and I seem to do better when I'm just talking one-on-one to people than trying to be a presenter. Mr. Ulrich.
The fuel pressure on the left engine was a lot lower than the right engine. I would wonder about that. It looked like it was running about 10. It was above the green line. But having had a dual fuel pump failure in my career, yeah, you can see it's running with 40 and the other was 50, and it was a bigger difference in a couple other slides. Is that? Yeah, it's down to 38 there.
Yeah, that's at full power. I can't answer that from a maintenance standpoint, but I know that typically what I've learned is that I like to see about 43 on both sides. And I think these are probably fine. They're hard to adjust, but they can be adjusted and they can be matched. So if there's nothing else, just see me afterwards and we'll get back on our schedule.
Ken, can you comment on that? What you talked about fuel pressure, because sometimes talk about that.
Yeah, just the differences in fuel pressure in normal flight. Like for example, here we're looking at about 38 on the left and 40, maybe 48 on the right. They're within parameters. Huh? Boost pumps are on in this case, yes.
There's a pressure regulator on the back of the Rolex fuel pump.
There's a pressure regulator on the back of the Romac fuel pump that can be adjusted, but they are a pain to get at.
And it adjusts the pressure to the engine, which is what this has been measured. It looks like it could be brought up. It looks like it might need overhaul. It could be any of that sort of thing. Joel Stout? Wake up, call. Yeah.
That's about the pressure, standard pump, 38 to 42 or something like that for the engine pump. And then you have the electric boost pump at around 50. And it just looked like it was off. I didn't,
Yeah, it looks the same to me. It is a pressure regulation problem. Could be a weak pump, but pressure regulator is where you start.
Both pumps were on. I know that for a fact, and it is in the video. So both pumps are on. They're both. This one has just on and off.
fuel pumps are kind of notorious, like kind of wearing out, it seems.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
It seems like a weak part of it. Like we keep all of them in stock just because, like even like the 5002s, the 200F 5002, which are the new ones, we seem to have just as many problems. They seem better, but
They didn't cure it. They just made it better. Yeah, I agree.
yeah, but there's still issues. But yeah, they're a real pain to kind of adjust sometimes, and they're not. It's not like you turn it a half a turn, it's going to turn up a certain number of psi.
Right.
And then one flight it might be one thing, and the next flight so they can be a little finicky, but that is a little excessive, I would say.
Okay.
I feel like I see a lot of have differential fuel pressure. So like it's in the green.
Okay.
From my experience, I very rarely see both engines have the same.
I have a question for all the flight instructors in the room that comes to mind when I watch this presentation by Eric. How many of you start your training immediately after takeoff? How about taking these airplanes you haven't flown before The owner hasn't flown before. Take it up to altitude. See how it performs. Don't start your training, don't start single engine operation right off the end of the runway. Ron
Well,
Cox.
that's the first flight on every single flight, Ken. Come on.
Ron Cox is notorious about taking an engine away from you on takeoff. It scares the crap out of me. He's been doing it forever. But anyway, he's lived a long life, and now he's pretty much done. But how many of you are taking an engine of an airplane you're unfamiliar with and removing that engine power from off of takeoff, of the first takeoff roll? Nobody?
None.
Thank God. Thank God.
So even to Ken, to add to that even more,
Okay.
those first flights, I don't care if they're a 767 captain with 20,000 hours.
Right.
Those
It's a new
first,
airplane.
it's a new airplane. The first
both
thing
of
we
you,
do
really.
is there's at least an hour on the ground, if not more, on a ground power unit, messing with the airplane, getting used to where things are, talking about it to where when they start the flight, that first flight, we're going up high to do air work, get the feel for the airplane. But before you even go, you get a pretty good idea of where everything is at, what everything does, so that muscle memory on where switches are
Right.
is starting to come into play.
Good.
I like this idea and ours are all going up. Usually that engine work, single engine work, doesn't happen until probably phase 3 or 4 in the training, and then it's gradually. So even on recurrent training, and some of you guys have been up that have been rusty know that we go up high, and we start off with just a gentle throttle reduction to 0 thrust and fly the airplane around, see how it feels, what's going on, how much yaw do you get, and then you keep building up a little bit slower air speeds and so on until the drill meaning power up, clean up, identify, verify, feather, all that stuff is pretty much second nature. Sometimes it's 1 or 2, depending on the experience of the pilot. Sometimes it takes 7 or 8 tries before I'm comfortable with their procedures, and they're not going to try to kill me when I bring the throttle back at 100 feet off the runway on a simulated engine out on takeoff.
Right.
And when we do it that way, it's just it's a no-brainer. It's the immediate bank into the good engine, flying the airplane first, keeping it under control, flying straight out or avoiding obstacles, back into the pattern, come back and land. And I'm not going to do anything that's going to put my butt at risk. My wife would kill me.
After the plane killed you, she'd kill you again. Very good. Anybody have another question? Roger?
You know, when you're taking off and you get cleared for takeoff, you know, you glance at the instruments when you're rolling out a little bit, but you don't concentrate on it very much because you work your way down the runway. We do a short field takeoff every time. Get out of the runway, put the brakes on, full power. You can feel the power coming up. You feel the turbos coming up. I figure if an engine's going to blow, it's probably 100% power that it's going to have.
Sitting there in a static position. I agree.
Yeah, and I'd rather the damn thing blow up on the ground, you know?
Oh yeah.
So, once everything feels good, we release brakes and take off. We climb out, we lift off at 95, and I think that's pretty close to what everybody does. Is that correct?
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah. And, you know, so far it's worked. It may not be 100%, but I think that gives a little bit of test of the airplane to make sure it is doing what it's supposed to do.
No, I agree with that, and especially if you're taking, pouring the coals to it static can be hard on the props depending on the condition of the runway, so you got to be careful with, where you're at, those runways are maintained pretty well. But at least getting it up to if it's to 30.
Temperatures.
Huh? Well, operating temperatures, yeah, I mean, that's kind of a given. We're just talking about before takeoff, so it's just the maximum performance takeoff situation to where you want it off the ground as quick as you can. So you're going to go to full power with the brakes on, and then let go. That gives you more time to see what's going on with the engine. You're stopped. You're not having to balance looking out of the airplane to the engine instruments. You've looked at them. They're full power. T's and P's, temperatures and pressures are all good. In my mind, I know what I'm going to do if I have an engine failure. It's not just, if the wheels are down and I lose it, I'm going to put it back on the ground. It's after the wheels are up, which direction am I going to turn? Left or right? Which engine's going to go bad? Can I turn into the bad engine? Yes, but you're going to have to do that very, very carefully. But there may be terrain that's going to dictate that. Right. So having those things all in your head before you pour the coals to it will potentially save your life.
Anybody have another question? Well, let's take a quick break and we'll get